I will introduce you now. I'll start by saying that he tweets at Timi the Law, Timi Thelaw. So go and follow him on Twitter there. One of Africa's foremost tech lawyers and policy consultants. Timi has a core capacity in digital policy and open governance. He is Africa's representative and global vice president, on the Global Members Advisory Board at the International Republican Institute's Generation Democracy. I managed to say it. Representing policy leaders and organizations across 70 countries, working on driving open governance. He is 2020's most influential young Nigerian in policy influencing, and he sits on the board of Feed to Grow Africa. He's won several awards for his distinction in policy, influencing, and open governance, including an award from the Uni of Life and President Barack Obama. He has made several presentations on digital policy, open governance, authored 2 books, namely The Hustler's Mentality and Yes, Africa Can. He participated in the research sprint on digital self-determination at the Berkman Klein Center, Society for Internet and Society in Harvard University. Wow. There's some incredible, we have great bios at MKAI, but tonight, these are just interstellar. They're just amazing. Timi, I'm going to take myself off the screen. It's 18:32. If I can ask you to go for about 22 minutes, is that okay?
Fantastic.
And
yes,
just shout if you need us. Otherwise, this space is yours, and it's wonderful to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too, Richard. And thank you for having me. And thank you to the MKI team for making this happen. I also want to thank previous speakers, David, Valerie, Rose, for doing such a fantastic job. Absolutely brilliant. When you are designated somewhat as the last speaker in this sense, you have the privilege, to summarize from very brilliant people. So you've laid a good foundation and also a good building. Perhaps, I could just put a roof on top of it. Primarily speaking, thank you everyone for being here. In the short time that we have together, I will be particularly discussing the issue of responsible AI in terms of a pathway beyond just regulations, right? And so in discussing the particular topic of responsible AI, a pathway beyond regulations, I will be doing 4 things. First, I will identify what guarantees a competitive advantage as AI develops. And secondly, I would also identify the 4 key areas of concern as AI evolves. David has talked about the future of AI and the fact that by 2045, we might be looking at the full development of AGIs, that's artificial general intelligence, right? So now the third thing is I would identify how regulations assuage these concerns. And then lastly, I would submit my submission or thesis will be aimed on 2 proposal pathways to guarantee a responsible AI and how to avoid the domination as AI evolves into the future. I would also be talking on a few things that previous speakers have touched on in that context. So to start with, fantastic the fact that Valerie had done what a professor is known to do, which is to profess. She has done a complete breakdown, some kind of simplification as to what AI is, right? What I would then do is take it on from there to say, for the sake of audiences, say that AI largely are being categorized into, say, 2 categories, largely, although there are 3, but I'll just mention the 2 broad categories, which is artificial normative intelligence, which is also called weak AI, and artificial general intelligence, which is the more robust, advanced, futuristic goal towards what AI can do, right? So interestingly, I'm sure that when we talk about artificial normative intelligence, we're talking of things we know, web optimization, you know them, chat boxes, and generally frameworks or platforms that leverage on AI, you know, in that context, self-driving cars, you know, you name them, a whole lot of it. I want to just quickly do an exercise before I proceed, which is, you know, artificial normative intelligence with AI, right? I want us to get on our phones or our keyboards on the chat session and type in, don't press enter, just type in the areas where you see AI in terms of artificial normative intelligence as we have it now, operational, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in, you know, automation, whether it's in manufacturing, whatever area that you have personally experienced or seen or heard artificial normative intelligence being applied. So we're going to type that into the chat box, but please don't press enter. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, please, to do that. And then I will tell you when to put enter on so that we can get our fingers exercised. Anyways, I hope that is good, Richard. Okay, so let's see. Just keep typing in areas where you think artificial normative intelligence has been applied or have experienced it. It's, you know, and like everywhere around us, like air, but don't press enter. In the next 20 seconds, our time will be up. Okay, so it's a good time for silence. Yes. Okay, we have 5 seconds. Okay, so somewhat time up. You can put in enter. Enter, let's see, flowing, you can see, right? It's coming in. Fantastic. Thank you, thank you. I just wanted to be sure that we were together on the same page. Now, we can see that artificial normative intelligence has a vast measure of use. Someone talked about OCR AI for crimes, right? So it's vast use, but like David rightly stated, there's a fact that we have a tendency in the next few years from now, say 2045, perhaps a little much earlier, because of the current drive and push and competition among nations to break through on artificial intelligence, right? So we might be seeing a move into artificial general intelligence in the future. Now, let's now come down to responsible AI. Now, in the context of responsible artificial intelligence, what in your context will that mean, right? So for me, it will mean ethical artificial intelligence. It will mean human-centered. It would also mean inclusive. It could also mean, you know, an artificial intelligence that that falls within the context of regulations and has a compliance framework built into it. Right? So responsible AI. Now, let's now move further to why should AI be responsible, right? Because that is a core context of conversation. Now, I want to take it from a more capitalist point of view, because you see, the future of artificial intelligence will be driven mostly by incentives, right? There must be incentive for driving the development, whether from the private sector or whatever sector. And the private sector will play a key role in driving that, right? And one of the key things is the fact that, you see, what will define competitive advantage in the development or evolution of artificial intelligence, as David Wood has rightly stated it, will be basically the concept of trust. It will not just be about the fact that there's certain superiority, right, to the quality, because at a time, a lot of countries would actually be able to beat their chest and say, look, our AI is the best, right? So it will not be about which is the best. It will now be about which can be trusted. And so that is what is going to define the competitive advantage going forward. Now, that drive towards the development of artificial intelligence will come with its challenges going forward, whether from artificial normative intelligence to artificial general intelligence, right? Or conscious artificial intelligence, whatever it is. 4 key areas of challenges will come up, and I've zoomed them into 1, data. 2, biases or inherent biases, right? 3, ethical issues. And 4, liability. In other words, who bears responsibility for what? So those are the 4 key areas of challenges that I'd already zoomed down into as artificial intelligence evolves going forward. Now, when you look at these 4 key areas, let's now break them down a bit and see where regulation comes in. Now, when you talk about data, right, there will be a challenge as to data, quality data. And by quality data, you might also be talking about how inclusive is the data, right? How responsible is the data? How compliant is the data? In that context, you might be looking at issues of data privacy, which interestingly has been robustly dealt with globally, except for a few developing countries where there's a challenge with robust legal framework for data privacy or data quality issues, right? And so what you have, for example, you have the European GDPR, which further conversation in the course of this program is going to talk about, right? And which has also influenced the growth of, data privacy laws globally to some extent, right? And you see some of the challenges inherent in that, for example, is that you see, when it comes to issues of regulating in that context, you see that some, in the context of the GDPR, a lot of private companies that were not compliant or did not meet up to the standards had to start to run helter-skelter, had to find a way to align with the provisions of the law, which led to a lot of rejig in the framework or in private sector as it were. And so that is some of the challenges we might see with regulations, because a lot of companies will try to play catch up because they had not been they've not had a minimal threshold framework for how the artificial intelligence is to evolve or how they're going to interact with artificial intelligence, right? So there'll be a data challenge. And how regulation is going to deal with that, is something that I'm going to delve into particularly now. Second thing is biases. How do you deal with the inherent biases? Are regulations enough to be able to anticipate biases, whether in terms of race, in terms of opinions, in terms of social gender biases? These are key issues. Now, ethical. By ethical, I do not just mean the ethics of it, but I also mean how inclusive will artificial intelligence be in terms of being acceptable to the users? Because if we do not deal with the ethical challenge, what we might then have is a distrust between the makers of artificial intelligence and the users of artificial intelligence. So ethics is quite key in terms of how do we also communicate the limitations and the uses of artificial intelligence to the end users. That is an ethical issue. And then lastly, liability. Who bears liability for whatever artificial intelligence is used and the consequent impact of such? For example, I remember that when Google released their AI, that started cursing or that started to produce curse words, and they had to retrieve it back, from the public. So who bears liability for what? Now, to a large extent, we see that, right, regulation can play a key role, for example, right, in terms of data privacy and a few others, but it is not enough. What else do we need? Now, even in terms of regulations itself can be an hindrance to progress, just as mentioned by Rose, in terms of local regulations hampering the development of, artificial intelligence in a particular location. So regulation can be a two-edged sword. It can be a blessing and a curse, right? Now, going forward in that context also, when you look at it, regulations also can be a blessing in the sense, but the challenge with regulation then will now be developing frameworks. For instance, in terms of intellectual property, IP issues, if an AI makes music, who owns the IP to that musical work, right? These are core issues that might come as antecedent issues out of, whatever AI produce in terms of who owns the copyrights to such music produced by artificial intelligence or an intellectual property work produced. So those are core issues of concern, right? And also in terms of liability, you talk about economic policy. How do you frame regulatory frameworks to protect the economy of a local environment from the influx of imported artificial intelligence that will stifle employment or, issues of such nature? So those are core issues of concern. However, artificial intelligence and regulations, it can be a two-edged sword. But you can see that the European Union has taken a step in terms of the proposal. Recently in April, the European Union came up with some proposal for, regulating artificial intelligence. And the focus of that proposal was as to the risks, reducing the risk or eliminating the risk, if possible, and increasing the opportunities with artificial intelligence. So it is a risk-based approach to regulation, and it identifies 4 key areas in terms of risk. Unacceptable risk, which needs to be prohibited. High risk, which needs to conform with certain assessments. Limited risk, which needs a certain level of transparency, and minimal risk, which requires certain codes of conduct. However, the challenge is that, for example, in the US, there is a much more hands-off approach to dealing with innovation and technology evolution, right? So there's already a challenge in terms of ideology or framework in that context. Right? So these are core issues of concern. And also a lot of critics have also complained about that regulation having been overtly broad. For example, it extends to Bayesian estimation, which a lot of people say it's a mathematical theorem, right? So these are core issues with regulations. And so having established that regulation cannot do it all, what are the 2 pathways that I will propose or submit in conclusion? First is the fact that, look, we must understand that there needs to be certain community, recognized community for AI governance framework, right? And so you see the evolution of the internet, you see the internet governance framework globally. But we can learn from the internet governance framework in terms of artificial governance framework to make it more inclusive, such that we bring in civil society, because I see that the conversation is largely between private sector and governments. But the role of civil society is key in terms of ensuring that issues of human rights, because as AI evolves, there will be challenges around issues of human rights, issues of digital self-determination as it interacts with artificial intelligence, right? The issues of the digital self or the self as a person and its interaction with AI. And so we need to start bringing in, as much as we have technical forums involving businesses and governments, we need the civil society players to be part of frameworks going forward in terms of the evolution of artificial intelligence. That's one. Because policymakers are often disconnected from the day-to-day activities within sectors, particularly when it comes to, and we cannot trust private companies. All the private companies coming up with frameworks, and you see, the truth about it, like Shakespeare said, what you do speaks so loud, I cannot hear what you say, right? And so we've seen antecedents where private players put policies in place, but they do not particularly follow those policies. And so we cannot particularly also trust them. So government needs to step in, civil society needs to step in, but it must be done carefully, not in terms of regulating to stifle development, but in terms of managing risk. I can see Jessel already. So second point, right, which is the last point here, is that you see, we also must understand the nature of international politics, because you cannot rule out international politics from the technological development, particularly in the AI. And so we need increased AI policy entrepreneurs. And in that context, I'm glad that Rose is with the United Nations. My second and last point is that there's the need for the role of international not-state actors in setting up inclusive agenda for the development of artificial intelligence. And by so doing, I'm not just talking about the United Nations, WHO, and the likes. I'm also talking about regional bodies. For example, as an African, I'm talking about African Union needs to step up to start playing a key role in framing frameworks for the development of its local artificial intelligence as it grows and evolves. Because with that, we might be able to solve some of the challenges that Rose mentioned in terms of leapfrogging and identify legal bottlenecks to the development of artificial intelligence for the common good of all. So thank you so much. Over to you, Richard and Giselle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Timi. I think it was completely full of insights, and it is important to know responsible AI has got many facets to it, mainly ethical is not just one part of it, but compliance, regulations, human-centered, inclusive, diverse, etc. are a part of it. And to consider a whole holistic view of it, what makes it more trustworthy is the key, not the performance or how fast your algorithm or how sophisticated it is. And to build that, we need to know what are the concerns and what are the key areas that could bring into picture the data, the biases, as well as the regulations. But what is important for us is, as we move ahead, it is important for larger corporations, for governments and local bodies to understand that society and the inclusion and building of frameworks is the key. It's the regulation and the inclusion, a marriage between the both, which is going to work, because regulation can have both the sides, as you mentioned. We can't overregulate because that can hamper innovation as well. So we need to find a midway so that we can build responsible AI and build better technologies. Thank you. Thank you so much, Timi. I leave you to the chat for any questions, and Richard, over to you for summarizing the event.